The 4 men came up the Arlon Road on foot, out of the gray light, carrying 2 white flags. One of the flags was a bedsheet taken from a farmhouse. It was the morning of December 22nd, 1944, and the snow on either side of that road was already stained with a week of fighting. They walked slowly, deliberately, the way men walk when they are betting their lives on the idea that nobody on the other side will shoot a white flag. A young soldier saw them first. Private First Class Leo Palma was lying behind a Browning automatic rifle in the lines of Fox Company, in the 2nd Battalion of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment. He did not fire. A staff sergeant named Carl Dickinson came forward, and a medic named Ernest Premetz, who spoke some German, came with him. 2 of the 4 Germans were officers. The younger one spoke English. He said they carried a written message for the American commander, and that the message demanded the honorable surrender of the town. The Americans blindfolded the 2 officers and walked them back toward the command post, leaving the 2 enlisted Germans waiting in the cold. The note traveled up the chain, from a foxhole to a battalion, from a battalion to a regiment, and finally to a barracks on the edge of a small Belgian crossroads town, where it was placed in the hands of the acting commander of the most famous Airborne Division in the United States Army. He was a 46-year-old artilleryman. He had been in command of these surrounded men almost by accident. He read the message, and then he said something. What he said became one of the most famous replies in the history of the American military. It went around the world inside of a week. It was printed in newspapers from London to Los Angeles. It got him a press conference at Eisenhower's headquarters and a medal pinned on his chest by George Patton himself. It is, to this day, almost the only thing most Americans know about the man who said it. But here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The famous version of this story is too clean. The real version is messier, and it is better, and it tells you something the legend has spent 80 years burying, because the truth is that the word was not really planned. The truth is that the man who said it was only there because the man who was supposed to be there had gone to Washington. And the truth is that the moment that word went out to the world, the credit for what happened at this crossroads started getting handed to people who were not standing in it. A lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have grandfathers and fathers who were in those foxholes, or who drove the trucks, or who flew the transports. I want to do it justice, so we are not going to do the postcard version. We are going to do the real one. This is the story of Bastogne, and the 2 words Anthony McAuliffe sent the Germans. But more than that, it is the story of how a system decided who would be remembered for it. To understand what happened on that road on December 22, you have to back up 6 days to the morning everything came apart. Before dawn on December 16th, 1944, the German army did something the entire Allied High Command had decided it could no longer do. It attacked. Not a spoiling raid, not a local counterpunch. A full strategic offensive, 3 armies, against a thinly held stretch of the Ardennes forest in Belgium and Luxembourg. The Germans committed more than 400,000 men to this. They massed roughly 1,400 tanks and assault guns, around 2,600 artillery pieces, and more than 1,000 aircraft. The codename was Watch on the Rhine, and the goal was breathtaking in its ambition. Hitler wanted to drive all the way to the port of Antwerp, split the British and American armies in 2, and force the Western Allies to the negotiating table. It was a gambler's plan, and for the first few days, the gamble was working. The reason it was working comes down to a simple fact about terrain. The Ardennes is thick forest cut by deep river valleys, and in 1944, it had very few good roads. An army on foot can move through woods. An army of tanks and trucks and fuel and ammunition cannot. It needs roads. And in that whole region, the roads all ran through a handful of towns. The most important of those towns was a place most Americans had never heard of and could not pronounce. Bastogne. 7 paved roads converged there, plus a rail line, all meeting at a single hub. The Germans had a nickname for it. They called it the Road Octopus. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the arteries of the entire southern half of the offensive. If the Germans took it, their armor could pour west toward the Meuse River. If the Americans held it, the German timetable would choke on its own traffic jam. Eisenhower understood this faster than almost anyone. According to Rick Atkinson, in his book The Guns at Last Light, the senior American command was slow to grasp the full scale of the attack. But the value of the road network was obvious to the men who knew the map. The one reserve Eisenhower had in his pocket was 2 airborne divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, resting and refitting near Rams in France after the brutal fighting in Holland a few months earlier. He ordered them forward. The 82nd went north. The 101st was sent to Bastogne. And here is where the legend starts to leave things out. because the 101st Airborne Division did not arrive at Bastogne ready for a siege. It arrived in a state that, frankly, should have gotten it overrun. These men had just come off Operation Market Garden. They were tired, they were under strength, and they were scattered. When the alert came on the evening of December 17th, hundreds of paratroopers were on leave in Paris. They had to be rounded up out of bars and hotels and rail stations. Many of the men who did load up had no winter clothing. They had no overshoes. Some did not have helmets. Some did not even have rifles and would draw them along the way or pick them up from the dead. The division was short on ammunition, short on medical supplies, and short on the cold weather gear that the coming 3 weeks would make a matter of life and death. And the man at the top was missing. The commander of the 101st Airborne was Major General Maxwell Taylor. When the Germans attacked, Taylor was not in France. He was in Washington, attending a staff conference. The assistant division commander, Brigadier General Gerald Higgins, was in England giving lectures on the lessons of Holland. So when the division got the order to move toward a battle that would define it forever, neither of its two senior generals was on the continent. Command fell to the senior officer present. That officer was the division's artillery commander, a stocky, ruddy-faced brigadier general named Anthony Clement McAuliffe. And I want to sit on this for a moment because I think it matters more than the histories usually admit. The most celebrated defensive stand in the history of the United States Army was commanded, in its decisive days, by a man who was not the commander, by an artilleryman, not an airborne infantry leader, by the third choice, by the man who happened to be standing there when the music stopped. If you have ever been the person who got handed the impossible job because the people above you were somewhere else when it landed, you already understand Anthony McAuliffe better than most of the books do. If you are finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to McAuliffe. So who is he? Because the answer is not what you would expect from the man at the center of an airborne legend. Anthony McAuliffe was born in Washington in the summer of 1898. He went to West Point during the First World War in one of the accelerated wartime classes and graduated right around the time the armistice ended that war. He was commissioned not in the infantry, not in the cavalry, but in the field artillery. And then he did what most officers of his generation did between the wars. He waited. The interwar army was a slow, small, starved institution. Promotion crawled. McAuliffe spent the 1920s and 1930s in the schools and the garrison posts that made up an artillery officer's life. Fort Sill, Hawaii, Fort Riley, the Command and General Staff College, the Army War College. He was still a captain in the middle of the 1930s, nearly 20 years after he had been commissioned. There was nothing in that record that screamed future legend. It was the record of a competent, patient, technically minded professional in an army that was not giving anybody much room to shine. The war changed his trajectory the way it changed everyone's. By early 1942, he was a lieutenant colonel on the War Department staff, working on equipment development. And here is a detail I love because it tells you who he was. McAuliffe helped oversee the development of two pieces of equipment you have heard of, the bazooka and the jeep. The man who would tell the German army where to put its ultimatum spent part of his war helping decide which anti-tank rocket and which utility vehicle the army would buy. In August of 1942, he pinned on a general star and became the artillery commander of the brand new 101st Airborne Division. He learned to jump out of airplanes in his 40s. He hurt his back doing it in a practice jump in the spring of 1944. And then, a few weeks later, he flew into Normandy on the night before D-Day anyway, in the lead artillery plane, and parachuted into the dark over France. When the assistant division commander was killed in a glider crash on the morning of the invasion, McAuliffe effectively stepped up. He earned the Distinguished Service Cross for pulling scattered men together and helping take a vital causeway. He fought at Carentan. He went into Holland by glider in September. His own men called him Old Croc. His fellow officers called him Tony. His aide, a captain named Vincent Vicari, said something about him that becomes important very soon. Vicari said that General McAuliffe was the only general he ever knew who did not curse, that the word nuts was simply part of the man's everyday vocabulary. Hold on to that. Rick Atkinson, in The Guns at Last Light, describes McAuliffe as a gunner who had risen slowly, a man interested in new technology and new ideas. He was not a flamboyant cavalier in the Patton mold. He was the quiet professional who had spent 20 years learning his trade in obscurity, and who now, through no design of his own, was about to be handed the most important crossroads in Europe. The division moved out of Camp Mormelon in France on the afternoon of December 18th. They went in open-topped trucks, around 380 of them, riding through a freezing night of snow and sleet. They drove with their headlights on, which was almost unheard of, because there was no time for caution. At one point, the column stretched roughly 75 miles, from one Belgian town all the way back into France. Bastogne was about 107 miles from where they started. Belgian civilians, watching the trucks roll past, handed up blankets and white linens for the men to use as camouflage in the snow. Think about that. The civilians were helping equip the army that was supposed to be protecting them. The lead elements reached the area just west of Bastogne in the small hours of December 19, and the rest of the division closed up by mid-morning. They were not the first Americans there, and this is the part the legend almost completely erases. A day before the paratroopers arrived, on December 18th, a piece of the 10th Armored Division had already rolled into Bastogne. Combat Command B, under a colonel named William Roberts, did something that takes real nerve. Instead of consolidating his armor into one fist, Roberts deliberately broke it into 3 small teams and threw them out onto the eastern approach roads to buy time, knowing he might lose all 3. The men called them by their commanders' names. Team Cherry went toward Longvilly. Team de Sobry went north to Noville. Team O'Hara went toward Warden. Each one was a few dozen tanks and a handful of infantry sent out to stand in front of a panzer division and slow it down. What those teams did in the next 2 days is, in my view, every bit as important as anything that happened later, and almost nobody remembers it. At Noville, Team de Sobry, joined by a battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry, fought off the 2nd Panzer Division through a foggy morning, knocking out a string of German tanks before the fog lifted and the position became untenable. They held a vital northern road for the better part of 2 days and were nearly destroyed doing it. The young major commanding the team was so badly wounded he was captured in a field hospital. At Longvilly, Team Cherry was overrun and scattered. The price was brutal. But every hour those teams bled out east of Bastogne was an hour the 101st used to dig its foxholes and register its artillery. Before all of them, the shattered remnants of the 28th Infantry Division had spent December 16 through 18 being ground up in a delaying action that bought the very first hours, the ones that made everything else possible. The legend remembers a word spoken on December 22nd. It forgets the men who died on December 18 and 19, so that there would still be a town standing on December 22 for anyone to defend. And there was more. McAuliffe did not command just paratroopers. He commanded a scratch force assembled from whatever the catastrophe had thrown into the town. He had the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which arrived late on December 19 and gave his armorless paratroopers something that could actually kill a tank. He had the 969th and 755th Field Artillery Battalions. And here's a fact you will almost never hear in the standard telling. The 969th was an African-American artillery unit. Black gunners helped hold Bastogne, firing in support of white paratroopers, in one of the earliest integrated combined actions the United States Army fought in that war. He had combat engineers from the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion, and he had a grab bag of stragglers from broken units, men with no home left, organized into a provisional outfit the troops bluntly nicknamed Team Snafu. McAuliffe knew exactly who had bought the time for him to set up. Years later, he said it had always seemed regrettable to him that Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division never got the credit it deserved. The commanding general himself said that, and the legend ignored him. Now the trap closed. The German force coming for Bastogne was the 47th Panzer Corps, under a general named Heinrich von Luttwitz, part of the 5th Panzer Army. It included the 2nd Panzer Division, the Panzer Lehr Division, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Panzer Lehr arrived just after midnight on December 19 and attacked, and was checked, and the Germans found the ground and the resistance unappealing enough that they decided not to throw the whole corps straight into the town. By the night of December 20 into December 21, the Germans had wrapped completely around Bastogne. The defenders were sealed inside a pocket only about 5 miles across, and then the Germans made a decision that, in my view, the legend has never given enough weight. The 2 strongest German formations, the 2nd Panzer and Panzer Lehr, did not stay to crush Bastogne. They peeled off and continued west toward the Meuse River, chasing the bigger prize. They left the job of taking the town mostly to the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and a single regiment of Panzer Lehr. I want to be honest about what this means, because the channel does not do hero worship. Bastogne was held against a force that outnumbered the defenders by something like 4 or 5 to 1, in brutal cold, on rationed ammunition. That is real, and it was heroic, but it was not held against the full weight of 2 panzer divisions, The Germans attacked piecemeal, one thrust at a time, around the edges of a circle, and the Americans, sitting in the center, could shift their artillery and their handful of tanks to meet each attack in turn. They were fighting on what soldiers call interior lines. That advantage is a huge part of why the line held. It does not diminish the courage of the men, but it does complicate the myth of a doomed garrison saved at the last second, and we are going to come back to that myth, because it is the heart of this whole story. It is worth understanding the German problem, too, because it explains why Bastogne never fell. The officer left holding the bag on the German side was the commander of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, a man named Heinz Kokott. He had been handed a town full of American paratroopers, and most of 2 panzer divisions had just driven off and left him to it. He was short of fuel. He was short of infantry to seize a built-up area defended in depth. And he was under a furious clock because higher command wanted the crossroads cleared so the offensive could breathe. So Kokott did the only thing he could. He probed. He jabbed at one sector, then another, looking for the soft spot in a circle roughly 5 miles across, hoping to find a place thin enough to crack. He never found it, because every time he massed against one point, McAuliffe's gunners and his small mobile force of tanks and tank destroyers would shift to meet him. The German was trying to break a ring from the outside with too little. The American was defending it from the inside with just enough. That is the real military shape of the siege, and it is a great deal more interesting than a one-word telegram. McAuliffe organized the defense the way an artilleryman thinks. He did not try to hold a continuous wall. He held the road junctions and the villages that controlled the approaches, with the 4 parachute and glider regiments fanned out around the compass. The tank destroyers and the 10th Armored Tanks held back as a mobile fire brigade, and the massed artillery in the center where it could reach any sector. When a German thrust developed, the threatened regiment held the shoulders while the fire brigade and the guns went to work on the penetration. It was an economical, professional plan run by a man who had spent 20 years studying exactly this problem. The legend gives him a word. The reality gives him a scheme of defense that worked against 5-to-1 odds. I know which one I find more impressive. Inside the perimeter, the situation was grim in ways the famous word never captures. The medical situation had collapsed almost immediately. On that very first night, December 19, the Germans overran the division's main medical company. Around 130 doctors, surgeons, and medics were captured, along with most of the surgical equipment. That meant that for the entire siege, the men holding Bastogne had almost no ability to perform surgery on their own wounded. Soldiers with survivable wounds died because there was no one to operate. By December 22, the artillery was so low on shells that the guns were rationed to roughly 10 rounds per gun per day. 10 rounds. To stop tanks, that is the situation. A scratch force, undersupplied, surgically crippled, surrounded, and rationing its ammunition in some of the worst winter weather Europe had seen in 50 years. And I want to put you in the foxholes for a moment, because the legend is told from the command post, and the real siege was fought in the snow. The men of the 101st held their line in temperatures that hovered around and below freezing, many of them without overshoes, without overcoats, without gloves, in fighting holes that filled with freezing water and then froze solid. Trench foot and frostbite put men out of action who had never been touched by a German bullet. The frozen ground was so hard that digging a foxhole could take hours, and an artillery burst against frozen earth threw more lethal fragments than the same shell in soft ground. The men burned anything they could find, raided cellars in the villages for potatoes and preserves, and stripped white linen from Belgian homes to make snow camouflage. Charles MacDonald, in his history of the battle titled A Time for Trumpets, captures this grinding misery better than almost anyone, and it is the part of Bastogne that gets the least screen time and cost the most suffering. A man did not have to be in the path of a panzer to be a casualty at Bastogne. The cold was hunting all of them, all the time. And the fighting on the perimeter never really stopped between the big set-piece attacks. Through December 20 and 21, as the ring closed, the Germans hammered at the eastern and southern approaches, and the new tank destroyer battalion earned its keep almost the moment it arrived. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, with its fast, open-top destroyers, became the mobile, sharp edge of McAuliffe's fire brigade, racing from sector to blunt German armor wherever it appeared. In the days around Christmas, those destroyers and the attached 10th Armored Tanks accounted for a long tally of German armored vehicles, and on Christmas morning, they would be decisive. The men of the 705th are another name the legend dropped. They were not paratroopers. They did not have the glamour. They just killed the tanks that would otherwise have killed the paratroopers. And it is into that situation that 4 Germans walked up the Arlon Road with 2 white flags and a typed demand for surrender. The demand itself was a remarkable document, and it is worth understanding what it actually said, because the famous reply only makes sense against it. The note was addressed to the American commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. It opened by announcing that the fortune of war was changing. It claimed that strong German armored units had surrounded the Americans, that other German units had taken towns to the west, and that there was, in its words, only one possibility to save the encircled American troops from total annihilation. That possibility was the honorable surrender of the town. The Germans gave a deadline of 2 hours. And then came the part that I find genuinely chilling in its tone. The note warned that if the Americans refused, German artillery would annihilate them, and it added that the resulting civilian casualties would not, and I am paraphrasing closely here, correspond with the well-known American humanity. In other words, surrender, or the blood of Belgian civilians is on your hands. It was signed, the German commander. There was just one problem with the note, and it is a problem the legend almost never mentions. It was, to a significant degree, a bluff. Several of the towns it claimed the Germans had captured were not actually in German hands. The American historian S.L.A. Marshall, in his early account titled Bastogne, The First 8 Days, noted that the German emissary's report was simply false on key points, and the threatened artillery barrage that was supposed to annihilate the town never came, for a simple reason. Most of the German heavy artillery had already moved west, past Bastogne, chasing the Meuse. The man who supposedly ordered the ultimatum, von Manteuffel, later told interrogators that the surrender demand was sent without his authorization. So the most famous surrender demand of the war may well have been an unauthorized bluff, threatening a bombardment that the Germans were no longer in a position to deliver. Now, the reply. This is what you came for, and I am going to give it to you exactly as the witnesses recorded it, because this is precisely the kind of moment where the legend and the documents disagree, and where the truth is more human than the myth. The note reached division headquarters in a barracks on the edge of town. The acting chief of staff, a lieutenant colonel named Ned Moore, took it. McAuliffe had been up most of the night and had finally lain down. Moore woke him. According to Moore's own account, he told McAuliffe that the Germans had sent some people forward to take the division's surrender, and McAuliffe, still half asleep, before he had even read a word of the note, said one word: nuts. That is the first version of the moment. It was not a defiant speech. It was a tired man's reflex on being woken up with absurd news. Then he actually read the note. And the official Army account of this episode, written years later by McAuliffe's own nephew, Kenneth McAuliffe, records that the general's first instinct on seeing the word surrender was confusion, and that what he said, reading it, was something close to, "Us surrender, aw, nuts." Then he dropped the paper. The staff had a real problem now. The Germans were waiting for a written reply, and the general had moved on. McAuliffe reportedly said, "Well, I don't know what to tell them." And it was the division operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Harry Kinnard, who supplied the line that made history. Kinnard said, "That first crack you made would be hard to beat." McAuliffe asked what he meant. Kinnard said, "You said nuts." The room laughed and agreed, and so the official, typed American reply to the German ultimatum was written out. It was dated December 22nd, 1944. It was addressed to the German commander. The body of the message was a single word: nuts. And it was signed, the American commander. I think this is the part of the story that actually deserves to be famous, and almost never is. The most celebrated act of defiance in the American war did not spring fully formed from a heroic jaw. It was a sleepy mutter, recovered and elevated by a sharp staff officer who recognized that his exhausted boss had accidentally said the perfect thing. That is not a knock on McAuliffe. In my view, it makes him more impressive, not less, because it shows a commander relaxed enough, and a staff close enough, to know that the honest reflex was better than anything they could have composed. But the message was not done, because now somebody had to deliver a one-word reply to the German army and make them understand it. That job fell to Colonel Joseph Harper, who commanded the 327th Glider Infantry, the same regiment whose men had received the Germans on the road. Harper drove out to the blindfolded German officers and handed over the reply. The English-speaking German officer read it and was baffled. He asked whether the reply was affirmative or negative. Harper told him it was decidedly not affirmative. And then, at the spot where the Germans were released to walk back to their own lines, Harper made sure there was no confusion. He told the German officers that the reply, in plain English, meant the same thing as "go to hell." The medic, Permetz, translated it into German for them. The German officers saluted, said they would, in effect, kill many Americans, and walked back into the snow. The whole exchange was over by around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And that, the legend says, is the climax. Defiant American general tells the Germans to go to hell, holds the line, gets rescued by Patton, the end. Except the legend skips the next 4 days, and those 4 days are where men actually lived and died, so we are going to spend time there. Because saying nuts did not lift the siege. It did not feed anyone, it did not heal anyone, and it did not stop a single tank. What saved Bastogne was not a word. It was the weather, the cargo, and the men in the holes. For the first days of the siege, the sky had been the enemy. Thick, overcast, grounded Allied aircraft, which meant no resupply and no close air support. The men in Bastogne were burning through ammunition they could not replace. And then, on December 23, the weather broke. The sky cleared. And the road octopus suddenly became the most heavily supplied square mile in Europe. Early that morning, Pathfinder teams parachuted into the perimeter to set up navigation beacons. This is a detail worth pausing on because it took outrageous courage. A small team of Pathfinders volunteered to jump into a surrounded town to plant the radio beacons that would guide the transport stream in. If the beacons failed, the drop would scatter across German lines and feed the enemy instead. They jumped anyway, set up their equipment in the open, and started talking the aircraft down. Then the transports came. The first major drop on December 23 involved around 241 transport planes, dumping over 100 tons of supplies onto a town the Germans thought they had strangled. The cargo came down under colored parachutes, and the colors were a code. Red canopies meant ammunition, blue meant medical supplies, yellow meant food, white meant equipment. Men who had been counting their cartridges that morning watched the sky fill with parachutes by afternoon. Over the next several days, official Army figures put the effort at over 900 transport sorties, delivering more than 850 tons of supplies into the pocket. Roughly 19 transport planes were shot down doing it, and around 50 more were damaged. Those air crews flew straight and level through German anti-aircraft fire at low altitude, so the bundles would land where the surrounded men could reach them. They do not get statues. They should. There was one thing the parachutes could not deliver well, and it was the thing the defenders needed most. Artillery ammunition was too heavy and too fragile to drop reliably by parachute. So on December 27, the Army flew in gliders, around 35 of them, carrying roughly 100 tons of heavy artillery shells through heavy fire, with some carrying gasoline. Glider pilots flew unarmored aircraft into a contested pocket because the guns inside were down to scraps. That is the kind of thing the word nuts gets remembered for, and that those pilots do not. But that was just the beginning of the worst of it, because the Germans had a deadline of their own. Hitler wanted Bastogne taken by Christmas. So before dawn on December 25th, the Germans threw their hardest punch. Von Lüttwitz and the local commander, reinforced with a fresh regiment, attacked the western edge of the perimeter, near the villages of Champs and Hemrula, in the lines held by that same 327th Glider Infantry. The assault was spearheaded by 18 tanks carrying infantry on their hulls. For a few hours, it was genuinely desperate. The German armor punched through the American line and got into the rear areas. And then the defense did what it had done all week. The paratroopers let the tanks roll past and cut the German infantry off them. The tank destroyers and the artillery and the bazooka teams went to work. By the time the fighting around Champs and Hemrol burned out, all 18 of those German tanks had been destroyed, and the glidermen had taken more than 90 prisoners. The Christmas attack, the all-out effort Hitler had demanded, had failed. But Christmas at Bastogne had a darker face than the morning battle, and I am not going to skip it because the men in those buildings deserve to be in this story. On Christmas Eve, German bombers came over the town at night and bombed it in 2 waves. One of the strikes hit a building on the Rue Neufchâteau that was being used as an aid station for wounded American soldiers. The bombs killed roughly 20 to 30 wounded men who could not move, and they killed a young Belgian woman named Renée Lemaire. She was 30 years old, a civilian volunteer who had spent the siege nursing wounded American soldiers in that aid station. The men called her the Angel of Bastogne. She died caring for soldiers who were not even from her country. A second volunteer nurse, a Congolese Belgian woman named Augusta Chiwi, survived and kept working. When we talk about who held Bastogne, those 2 women belong in the count. This is the part the official histories tend to move past quickly, and I will not. The famous word was about defiance. Renée Lemaire's death was about the price. Both are true. Only one of them is on the postcards. Now, the relief. because no story about Bastogne is complete without the moment that the legend turned into the climax, the arrival of Patton. Back on December 19, at a grim conference in Verdun, Eisenhower had told his commanders to stop thinking defensively and start counterattacking. He turned to George Patton, whose Third Army was at that moment pointed east, attacking into the Saar, and asked how soon he could attack north into the German flank. And Patton said something that stunned the room. He said he could attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. According to the accounts collected by historians like Leo Barron in his work on Patton at the Bulge, Omar Bradley's reaction was essentially disbelief, telling Patton he would give himself more leeway than that. What Patton then pulled off was, I will say plainly, one of the genuinely brilliant feats of staff work and command of the entire war. The reason he could promise 3 divisions in 48 hours was not bravado. It was preparation. Days earlier, sensing where things were going, Patton had quietly told his staff to draft contingency plans for exactly this kind of turn, and to work out a simple code so he could trigger one of them with a single phone call. So when Eisenhower gave the order, the machinery was already half built. Patton walked to a phone, said a code word, and an entire army began to wheel. He took an army that was attacking in one direction and turned a large part of it 90 degrees to attack in another, across icy roads, in the worst winter that part of Europe had seen in roughly 50 years, in a matter of days. Staff officers redirected traffic, fuel, and ammunition across a road network choked with ice and snow. Tens of thousands of men, by some popular accounts, 250,000 across the whole army, changed their axis of advance. The lead element was the 4th Armored Division. The assault jumped off early on December 22 from assembly areas north of Ardennes, only about 24 miles south of Bastogne as the crow flies, though the road march to get the division into position had been far longer, on the order of 150 miles or more of frozen road before the attack even began. This was not the whole Third Army magically teleporting. It was 3 divisions in a hard, grinding attack up frozen roads against German resistance. But the speed and the coordination of the pivot were real, and they were remarkable, and Patton earned every bit of praise for the operation itself. The fighting north was slower and bloodier than the legend suggests. It took 4 days to cover that ground. And the breakthrough, when it came on December 26th, came down to a single battalion commander making a gamble. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion, was down to around 20 tanks. He looked up, saw the transport planes dropping supplies into Bastogne, and decided to stop probing and punch straight through the village of Assenois. It was a calculated risk that could have gotten his whole battalion cut off. American artillery hammered Assenois with over 2,000 shells to clear the way. And in the late afternoon, around 10 minutes to 5, a single Sherman tank reached the lines of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion on the southern edge of the perimeter. The tank commander who made that first contact, a lieutenant named Charles Boggess, said something afterward that I think belongs in any honest telling of the story. He said he believed every man gets a few minutes of glory in his life, and that has lasted 4 miles in 25 minutes. That is the whole battle in one sentence. A few minutes of glory, bought with days of grinding misery by men whose names nobody remembers. The first American outside the pocket shook hands with the first American inside it. A short time later, Abrams himself shook hands with McAuliffe. The corridor was open. Clearing Assenois took until evening and yielded over 400 prisoners. The siege period was over. But the fighting around Bastogne went on for weeks, and the 101st was not pulled off the line until the middle of January. Here are the numbers, and the numbers tell the rest of the story. The relief did not come cheap. According to Hugh Cole, in the United States Army's official history of the campaign, titled The Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, the 4th Armored Division lost about 1,000 men in the 7 days it spent fighting its way to Bastogne. The defenders had bled even harder. The 101st Airborne's losses during the siege itself run to roughly 189 killed, over 1,000 wounded, and more than 400 missing, and that is just the core siege window. Across the full Bastogne campaign, into January, the division's figures climbed to around 482 killed, nearly 2,500 wounded, and over 500 missing or captured. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored, the men McAuliffe said never got their due, took around 500 casualties of their own. And those are just the men at this one crossroads. The wider Battle of the Bulge was the largest and bloodiest single battle the United States Army has ever fought. According to the United States Army Center of Military History, the Americans suffered some 75,000 casualties in the battle, while the Germans lost between 80,000 and 100,000. The National Archives records more than 19,000 American soldiers killed in the Bulge, more dead than in any other battle the United States fought in the entire war. Stack those numbers next to a one-word telegram and you start to feel the gap between what happened and what gets remembered. Now we come to the part of this story that this channel exists to tell. Because once the siege was lifted, a second battle began, not over ground, over credit. And that battle reveals the machine underneath the whole thing. George Patton framed Bastogne as a rescue. He had ridden to the relief of the surrounded garrison, and he was not shy about saying so. He wrote to his wife that the relief of Bastogne was the most brilliant operation his army had performed. When he heard about the nuts' reply, he reportedly said that any man that eloquent deserved to be relieved, and that they would go right away. And to be fair to Patton, the pivot of the Third Army genuinely was a magnificent piece of generalship. Nobody serious disputes that. But the men inside Bastogne heard the word rescue, and it made them furious. And it has made their successors furious for 80 years. The 101st Airborne's own official position is blunt. The division's historian, writing for the Fort Campbell Historical Foundation, put it this way. Although it was later claimed that Patton's Third Army rescued the 101st, no member of the division has ever admitted to needing rescuing. One veteran, Norwood Thomas, said it about as directly as a man can. He said rescue did not exist in his vocabulary. He said Patton brought relief to the men in Bastogne, but not rescue. Now, why does that distinction matter so much to these men? It matters because of what airborne troops are. Paratroopers are designed to be dropped behind enemy lines and surrounded. Being cut off is not a disaster for them. It is the job. They expect to hold until a relief force reaches them, and at Bastogne, that is exactly what they did. From the perspective of the men in the foxholes, they had blunted every German attack, destroyed every tank that came at them on Christmas morning, and were being resupplied by air. They did not see a garrison about to fall. They saw a garrison doing precisely what it was trained to do. So who is right? And here, as always, this channel is going to give you the honest assessment, not the comfortable one. The truth is in between, and both sides are partly right. The defenders had not lost the crossroads, and after the air resupply began on December 23, they were in no immediate danger of losing it. The Germans had shot their best shot on Christmas and lost all 18 tanks doing it. In that sense, the word rescue oversells the peril, but the defenders were also short of ammunition. They had almost no surgical capacity after losing their medical company, and they could not have held forever against a determined, reinforced enemy. The corridor, Patton's tanks opened, restored their supply, and let them evacuate their wounded at last. In that sense, relief is exactly the right word. The 4th Armored did not save men who were about to be wiped out the next morning. It saved men who were running out of the things that keep an army alive over time. Relief, yes. Rescue, no. And the reason that one word matters is that the word rescue quietly transfers the achievement. It turns the men who held the line for a week into victims, and it turns the men who arrived at the end into saviors. And that, more than any single decision, is how the credit at Bastogne got redistributed. And I want to be careful and fair here, because this channel does not do hit jobs, and the target is not really Patton. Patton told the truth about his own operation, which was superb. The problem is the shape of the story the public was handed afterward, and who got written out of it. Look at who actually held that crossroads. The paratroopers of the 101st, the tankers of Combat Command B of the 10th Armored, who got there first and bled to buy the time, the tank destroyer crews of the 705th, the African-American gunners of the 969th Field Artillery, the engineers, the stragglers of Team Snafu, the transport and glider crews who flew through fire, a Belgian nurse named Renée Lemaire. That is who held Bastogne. And the public memory compressed all of them into one general saying one word, and then handed the rescue to a different general entirely. I will make the parallel once, because it is the reason so many of you feel this story in your bones, and then I will leave it alone. If you have ever watched the person who did the actual work get folded into a footnote, while the person who managed the story upward got the headline, you already know exactly how the men of the 101st felt reading the word rescue. The pattern is older than any of us. The Army in 1944 was not immune to it, and neither is any place you have ever worked. Here is the institutional verdict, and it is the thing I most want you to take from this. The system did not lie about Bastogne, exactly. It simplified it. And simplification is its own kind of theft, because a battle held by a coalition of forgotten units gets remembered as the act of one quotable man, and the relief mounted by a brilliant army gets remembered as a rescue of helpless victims. Neither of those is false. Both of them are smaller than the truth, and no one paid a stranger price for that simplification than the man who said the word. Because here is what happened to Anthony McAuliffe. He became, overnight, one of the most famous soldiers in the American Army, and he spent the rest of his life being introduced as the punchline to a joke he told half asleep. The first American press mention of the nuts reply appeared on December 26th. By early January, he had been summoned to a press conference at Eisenhower's headquarters in Paris. Patton pinned a Distinguished Service Cross on him. He was promoted to Major General almost immediately and given command of an infantry division for the rest of the war. And then the legend ate the man. Maxwell Taylor flew back from Washington, reached Bastogne with the relief column around December 27, and resumed command of his division. Taylor went on to one of the most decorated careers in the modern Army: Superintendent of West Point, Army Chief of Staff, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Ambassador to South Vietnam. The man who was in Washington when the battle started ended up far more powerful and far more remembered than the man who fought it. McAuliffe's own post-war career was, in fact, genuinely distinguished. He ran the Army's Chemical Corps. He was the head of Army personnel. He commanded the 7th Army. He rose to become Commander-in-Chief of the United States Army in Europe. And he pinned on his 4th star in 1955 before retiring the following year. That is a remarkable career by any measure. And yet, when he died of leukemia in 1975, the obituaries led with the word, not the 4 stars, not the European command, the word. Reportedly, he grew tired of it, of being trotted out for the rest of his life as the man who told the Germans where to go. I think there is something quietly tragic in that, and it is the deepest layer of this whole story. A man spends 20 years as an anonymous artilleryman. He gets handed an impossible command by an accident of scheduling. He performs under pressure about as well as a human being can, and his reward is to be reduced, for the rest of his life and forever after, to a single syllable he muttered while half asleep, while the credit for the outcome flows to the commander who was absent and the general who arrived at the end. The system gave him fame and took his substance in the same transaction. Let me give you the operational detail that the casual viewer never hears, because I think it is the thing that actually won Bastogne, and it had nothing to do with words. It was the artillery, and it was McAuliffe's home discipline. The reason a surrounded force could beat back attack after attack from every point of the compass was that the Americans sat at the center of the circle and could mass the fire of all their guns onto any threatened sector faster than the Germans could exploit a breakthrough. McAuliffe was an artilleryman. He understood in his bones that the gun was the great equalizer for an outnumbered force on the defensive. When the 18 German tanks broke through on Christmas morning, what destroyed them was not heroism alone. It was the coordinated work of tank destroyers, bazooka teams, and above all, massed, centrally directed artillery fire, even with the guns rationed to a handful of rounds. The single most important qualification of the man in command of Bastogne was not that he was a paratrooper. It was that he was a gunner who knew how to make a few guns do the work of many. In my view, the Army got luckier than it ever admitted that the officer left holding the bag was an artilleryman. A pure infantry officer might not have squeezed that much out of so little. So let me bring this all the way back to where we started, to 4 men walking up a snowy road with a bedsheet on a stick. The legend of Bastogne is a clean little fable, a defiant general, a perfect word, a heroic rescue. It is the kind of story a system tells about itself when it wants to feel good. And almost every piece of it is, on closer inspection, more complicated and more honest and more human than the fable allows. The general was a stand-in. The word was an accident, recovered by a sharp staff officer. The bombardment threatened in the ultimatum was a bluff the Germans could no longer back up. The strongest enemy divisions had already left for the Meuse. The defense was held by a coalition of forgotten units, not one famous division alone. The town was kept alive by transport pilots and glider crews flying through fire, not by a slogan. The relief was real and brilliant, but it was relief, not rescue. And the man who said the famous word spent the next 30 years watching it swallow everything else he ever did, while the absent commander and the relieving commander collected the larger share of the glory. I do not tell you this to take anything away from the men who were there, just the opposite. The truth makes them larger, not smaller. The real Bastogne is a story about ordinary professionals, an artilleryman, a glider colonel, a sleepy staff, a Belgian nurse, a battalion of black gunners, a battalion commander who gambled on a dash through one village, doing extraordinary things under impossible conditions, and then being flattened by the machinery of memory into a single quotable line. The word nuts is not the lie. The word is true. The lie is everything the word was allowed to erase. That is the gap this channel exists to close, between the legend and the reality, between the man who got the headline and the men who held the line. Anthony McAuliffe held a crossroads that broke the timetable of the last great German offensive of the war, and he did it as the third choice for the job, with a scratch force on 10 rounds a gun. He deserves to be remembered for all of it, not just for the 2 words. If your father or grandfather served at Bastogne, in the 101st Airborne, in the 10th Armored, in one of the artillery battalions, or flew those transports and gliders, or drove one of those trucks up from Mourmelon through the snow, I would like to hear about it. Those stories matter, and they are exactly what the legend leaves out. Drop them in the comments. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.